This is the Bloomberg Daybreak, your podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Wednesday, the 1st of May in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, expectations grow that the Federal Reserve will today signal a delay to rate cuts.
Japan's Yentervention fizzles in the face of dollar strength.
Plus, Sunak's comeback bid. The Prime Minister does his best to avoid a catastrophic result in tomorrow's local elections.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
The Federal Reserve is expected to hold rates today and signal no plans for cuts in the near future. Bloomberg Economics also believes Chair Jerome Powell will adopt a notably more hawkish tone in his comments following the decision. The expected hawkish pivot comes after a series of hotter-than-expected inflation and economic data led traders to unwind bets on multiple cuts in the coming months. The former Reserve Bank of India Governor Raghuram Rajan says Fed policymakers got ahead of themselves at recent meetings.
The fact that we are in a very uncertain world, that we've switched from soft landing to hard landing to no landing and back, I think that would suggest a little bit of caution when the Fed tries to predict the future. And it should, with hindsight, have basically stayed with we will know when enough is enough and we can start cutting, but right now we're not going to make strong predictions.
Raghuram Rajan also hinted that the Fed may need to raise rates in future if data continues to come in hotter than expected. We'll bring you the rate decision live here on Bloomberg at 7 p.m. London time with Chair Jerome Powell's press conference 30 minutes later.
Interest rates remaining high in the US will continue to drive strength in the dollar. On Monday, that appears to have forced Japanese authorities to intervene to prop up the yen for the first time since 2022. Bank of Japan accounts analysed by Bloomberg suggest intervention did take place. Bloomberg's Garfield Reynolds says failing to step in could have left authorities with a number of problems.
The reverse argument would be, well, if they hadn't intervened and you were starting from 160 or more yen per dollar, then who knows where you could end up. 170 would come into play pretty rapidly, and that's the sort of thing that would have a lot of impacts on Japan's economy, on the political situation.
Garfield Reynolds speaking there on Bloomberg Television. Recent yen swings might be an indicator of worse to come as the Federal Reserve looks unlikely to cut interest rates during today's policy setting meeting. Pressure on the currency could build even further if Fed Chair Jerome Powell takes that hawkish tone we mentioned this evening.
New York City police surged onto Columbia University's campus overnight, arresting pro-Palestinian demonstrators who'd barricaded themselves into a building. According to reports, dozens of people were detained and loaded onto buses as chants continued.
Who do you protect? Who do you serve? Who do you protect? Who do you serve? Who do you protect? Who do you serve?
Those were protesters at the scene chanting there. University leaders said in a statement that they were left with no choice but to call authorities after Columbia's own security personnel were forced out of the building. The police action caps 2 weeks of rising tension at the university, which saw more than 100 arrests on April 18th.
Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has publicly criticised the UK regulator's plans to name and shame companies that it's investigating. In a rare political intervention, Hunt said that he hopes the Financial Conduct Authority will re-look at their decision after an industry backlash. The financial watchdog says that firms and consumers would benefit from knowing which issues are in the watchdog's sights, but the FCA says that plans are still at the consultation stage.
Amazon's cloud unit posted its strongest sales growth in a year. The first quarter results are a sign businesses are starting to spend more on tech projects, partly driven by AI demand. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow explains.
The strategy is basically to be a place where other companies who are interested in AI can build whatever software it is they want on AWS's platforms.
Ludlow adds that the company's $15.3 billion operating profit is also down to CEO Andy Jassy's cost-cutting programme. Despite that, Amazon's main e-commerce business slightly missing analysts' estimates as consumers tried to save money.
And here in the UK, Rishi Sunak has urged supporters to take part in the, quote, greatest comeback in political history as he trails badly behind in the polls. Bloomberg understands that the Conservative leader attempted a rallying speech to party campaigners ahead of local elections tomorrow. Bloomberg's James Wilcock has more.
Since the 1990s, if the opposition had been ahead in the polls by more than 5 percentage points a year after the general election, they've taken over government. Labour are currently 20 points ahead. So when Rishi Sunak talks about the greatest comeback, that is the political gravity he's trying to overcome. His remarks are also a tacit admission of the electoral clobbering he's expected to take in Thursday's local elections, which some Conservatives think may then be used to try and unseat him. In London, James Wilcock, Bloomberg Radio.
Well, in a moment, we're going to look ahead to the Federal Reserve rate decision and also to tomorrow's local elections in England and Wales that James was discussing. But of course, there's always a few stories that have caught our eye on the Bloomberg terminal this morning. And I think this one's quite close to home for you, Stephen.
Yeah, as of today, Ireland has no listed companies with a female CEO. That's after the CEO of Irish Residential Properties, REIT PLC, Margaret Sweeney, retired yesterday. So she's been replaced by a man. There are only 31 listed companies on the Euronext exchange in Dublin, but now none of them are led by a woman, and that makes Ireland among EU member states only joining Luxembourg as having no female CEOs of public firms. Now, the levels across the EU aren't particularly high, or it should be, say, across the world either.
Sure.
It's not as if Europe is underperforming in this level either, but the lack of gender equality at the top of companies listed on Ireland's stock exchange is, according to the 30% Club, exacerbated by the fact that it's dominated by traditionally male-heavy industries like construction. Now, it's worth saying that representation on boards is improving. At the end of November 2023, female board representation was at 39% in Ireland, which is up from 18% just 5 years previously. That's after a number of government-level steps that have been taken. There are other areas of the Irish economy that do see better representation of women, particularly the start-up scene in particular. But then Ireland also has the same listings problem that lots of other parts of Europe have as well. A lot of these companies aren't choosing to list on the stock exchange in Ireland when they are going public. They're choosing to do so in the US, a story that we see in lots of other parts of the continent too.
I think it's a very fascinating story, and it's a really interesting one also about, you know, how much the goals of government actually seep into business or not. A very good story to have a look at on the Bloomberg terminal this morning.
Well, let's turn back to the Federal Reserve decision later. Officials expected to keep interest rates on hold, but markets will be watching to see how Jerome Powell and his colleagues are reacting to the recent higher than expected inflation data. Bloomberg TV anchor Kriti Gupta is with us to help us look ahead to that. Morning, Kriti. Can you remind us, first of all, of the key data the Fed will be considering going into this meeting?
Well, it's so funny because we should be considering the CPI. That's the no-brainer, right? Even the PCE, which kind of takes out some of those core costs as well. Now they have other pieces of data that they have to take into account. They can't blame it on just anomalies. And I think the greatest example of this is just within the last 24 hours, the employment cost index over in the States coming in really, really hot. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with kind of this data set, it's what the name suggests, an employment cost index. It's quite literally the kind of amalgamation of what costs look like from a more wage perspective across the 50 states. Now, this number came in hot because wages are rising in the States. And we know that. We kind of knew that was going to happen with a lot of these minimum wage decisions that have been made across, I think, like 25 states or so out of 50. So we knew that there was going to be this push anyway. The problem is the numbers came in significantly hotter than we had expected just from those minimum wage increases. So that's where you're starting to see a little bit of kind of spooking in the markets. And you saw a real market reaction off of that data because it suggests that some of the inflationary numbers that we're seeing are not one-offs. You are seeing this spread across the economy, and you're seeing it spread across regions, more importantly. And that's a really important piece of this equation because now the Federal Reserve can look at this data and say this is not just goods-driven inflation, this is services-driven inflation, and this is wage-driven inflation, when for years they were really trying to combat the inflationary story because wages weren't keeping up.
Okay, so how likely is that then to play into the press conference and into the statement and the decision-making?
Well, I imagine he'll be asked about that in the press conference, specifically in terms of what the data points he's actually looking at, Caroline, and Stephen, the very first questions that you guys asked me, simply because they are known famously to only kind of really zero in on that PCE deflator number. So now that they're seeing different pieces of it, is this still a commodity-driven story? Is this a kind of labor market story still? Or do we need to look at other pieces of the policy tools? So if we're not looking at rate decisions, do we need to look at QT, for example? Do we need to look at what's going on with the Treasury? Is election risk even relevant to the Fed? They'll say no, but I imagine they'll be pressed on it regardless.
Anything else that markets will be watching out for?
Definitely the story on the QT is important, but I think the Treasury may be more important. There's a lot of questions about the deficit story. There's a lot of questions about how that's kind of seeking, or I should say, creeping up, I think is the word that I'm looking for. Creeping up. The coffee hasn't quite hit yet. Bear with me. Creeping up on a lot of investors simply because this has a lot to do with Treasury supply, and it has to do with these buyback announcements. Remember, before we get the Fed decision, we also get that refunding announcement from the Treasury literally 30 minutes prior. So you're going to see the markets be very bouncy this morning in terms, or this afternoon, I should say, in terms of how they are reacting to what the government is doing. But we actually had a guest on Bloomberg TV said this very eloquently, that it might just be Janet Yellen who may be more in charge of policy than Jay Powell. And that seems to be the going concern, at least in terms of what investors are really watching.
Yeah, absolutely. And another piece to that, big reaction expected potentially in the S&P, at least from Citi, biggest Fed day move. That's the expectation. So it's really going to be hotly watched. The decision at 7 p.m. London time, the press conference half an hour later. Kriti Gupta, Bloomberg's TV anchor, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, here in the UK, voters will be going to the polls tomorrow in England and Wales, and local mayoral and police and crime commissioner elections tomorrow, some of which are seen as a bellwether for the Conservative Party's prospects at a general election we're expecting later this year. With the details, we've got Bloomberg's UK correspondent Lizzie Burden with us in studio. Morning, Lizzie. So, for the Conservative Party then, what are the key goals that they'll be hoping for? What are they going to be looking out for when it comes to what could be interpreted as a win or a big loss for them?
Well, you talk about these local elections as a barometer for the general. There are two elements that define the point at which Sunak's team around him and the wider party will lose hope of staying in power beyond the general. First of all, do the Conservatives lose half of the just under 1,000 seats that they won in 2021 across local councils? And secondly, do they hold on to Andy Street, the Tory mayor in the West Midlands, and Ben Houchin, the Tory mayor in Tees Valley? Because those two mayors really represent the party's ability to compete in Labour-facing areas. Now, the latest YouGov polling actually suggests that Street and Houchin are going to cling on, and that would be a major victory for Rishi Sunak, because it would calm the nerves about the general election being some sort of extinction event. But on point one, this could still be a bloodbath for the Conservatives.
OK. Will the local election result then put Labour on course to win the general election? How much of a kind of wind in the sails of what is already a pretty speedy Labour boat?
Yeah, they're very much on that course already, aren't they? Sunak's really failed to put a dent in Labour's 20-point poll lead, despite the fall in inflation and the turnaround in growth. His advisors say that last week was his best in office, but the problem is he hasn't been able to sustain a positive news cycle since getting the keys to number 10, and therefore he's failed to placate the right wing of his party, even when he's been preaching to the choir, you know, with policies like deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda. He still hasn't managed to keep the likes of Penny Mordaunt happy. And while he's had this ongoing failure to launch, at the same time, the opposition Labour leader Keir Starmer has just had another boost because Scotland's First Minister, Humza Yousaf, has resigned. Now, north of the border, Labour's only managed to get one seat in the 2015 and 2019 general elections. But now, with the SNP pretty much rudderless, things are looking up for Labour in Scotland, and it means that the path to Downing Street for Keir Starmer looks even clearer, and it seems it's going to run through Scotland.
Could these local election results be a catalyst, though, for the Tory party actually ousting Rishi Sunak as their leader?
Well, Sunak's critics on the Tory right are really going to use any bad result in these local elections as evidence to argue the only way to win the general is to change leader. because otherwise they'll have a total wipeout. But even if he does get hammered in these local elections, he could actually stay in number 10. Because remember, there's no obvious candidate to replace him, and the Conservatives are already on their third Prime Minister since Boris Johnson won the 2019 general election. The thing is, Conservative Party rules mean that the Rebels only need just over 50 letters from Tory MPs to trigger a no-confidence vote in the party leader. So Rishi Sunak cannot take his place for granted.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.